Morning, President. Take a seat.
בזמן.
Okay. Everybody has a book. If anybody doesn't have a book, they're on the table at the back. You can pick one up. Good morning. Thank you for coming. And the topic we're going to be discussing this morning is Chukot HaGoyim. Now, a few people have asked after the previous shiurim, if we can go a little bit slower, maybe go a bit more in depth into the sources and cover less ground. So that's what we're going to be doing. See how it goes. What we'll begin. We'll talk today more or less about the principles, about the underlying principles that come out of the sugya, from the Gemara, from the words of the Rishonim. If we have time, we'll go into some of the practical applications, but if not, we'll carry on with that next week. Page. It's the third share in the book. You've still got a few moments before we get to the book, but it is page 99. You're ahead of me. Okay. So 99. So maybe actually, let's open the book. Let's see just the source. Look at some of the psukim, and then we'll discuss. So we've been dealing until now. We've been going through the laws of Avodah Zarah. This is related, but the Torah has a separate prohibition, what's called Chukot HaGoyim, not to emulate the ways of the nations around us. The question is which ways and which nations, and what exactly is this prohibition? Where does it come from? Clearly, it doesn't mean that anything that the non-Jewish world does that we cannot do. Discussed already. We gave some. It sounds silly, but if you were to take this to an extreme, the non-Jewish world uses cars. The non-Jewish world uses computers. The non-Jewish world does all sorts of things. Clearly, the Torah is not telling us separate from the world and don't do anything. There has to be some parameter, some criteria, what's going on here. So we'll try and understand. If you have a look, page 99, source number 2, is the pasuk that says, K'maaseh eretz Mitzrayim, asher yeshavtem ba, lo ta'asu, u'k'maaseh eretz Canaan, asher ani mevi etchem shama, lo ta'asu, u'v'chukotehem, lo telechu. This is the famous source for Chukot HaGoyim, as we said. The last 3 words of the pasuk tells us, B'chukotehem lo telechu, do not follow their chukot, their statutes, their laws. Notice that the pasuk refers specifically to Maaseh Eretz Mitzrayim, the deeds of the land of Egypt, and the deeds of the land of Canaan. Right, it gives us specific examples, the lands where we were, the nations that were around us when we were being formed, when we were becoming a nation. Rashi tells us, source number 3, right, it says Maaseh Eretz Mitzrayim. It's singling out specifically these nations. These were the most corrupt, these were the most degenerate of all the nations. That place in Egypt where they were was a terribly immoral society. We know from various sources, various midrashim and the psukim, etc. Says that, continues Rashi, that the 7 nations who were, again, none of these nations exist today, but that existed at that time were the worst of all. It says, etc. Goes on. We won't read that for now. If you turn over the page 100, you see another few places, different psukim, where the Torah repeats this prohibition in various nuances, various ways. Source number 4. Lo telechu b'chukot hagoy, asher ani meshalech mipneichem, ki et kol ele asu va'ukatz bam. Right, talking about when you come into the land of Israel, don't go in the ways of the nation that was there, that's being sent away. All these things were terrible. The things that we're talking about. What did they do? Forms of idolatry, from child sacrifice, forms of very, very immoral forms of behavior. Source number 5, source number 6 repeats that again. If you look at source number 6, it's interesting. Says the pasuk in Shmot, Lo tishtachave le'Eloheim, v'lo ta'ovdeim, v'lo ta'aseh k'maasehem. Right? Don't bow down to their gods, don't worship them, don't perform their practices. Ki hares ta'aseh v'shaber tishaber matzevoteihem. You'll break their idols and not follow them. So already from these psukim, you see something. See that the theme of Avodah Zarah is something which comes up again and again. We'll see in just a few moments when we look at the Rishonim, we look at the Sugya and the Gemara. Is Chukot HaGoyim something which is related specifically to Avodah Zarah? Is it specifically something which is related to idolatry, or is it something broader? And there's going to be tremendous ramifications between that if there are practices which have no root in idolatry, or practices which we don't know if they have a root in idolatry. Would those be forbidden under Chukot HaGoyim as well? But we see that there is a connection. We see in these psukim as well, there seems to be a connection between specifically Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim and Maseh Eretz Canaan. So the question is, conceptually, when the Torah tells us, "B'chukotehem lo telechu," do not follow in the ways of the nations around you, is this really a sumera or is it an asetu? Is the Torah telling us that specifically there were certain nations, there were certain practices, these are immoral practices, these are improper modes of behavior, you should avoid those. Why? Because they are bad in and of themselves, and therefore it's something which is related specifically to Egypt, to Canaan, to these nations. Or do we look at this as something broader? Do we look at this as something not necessarily to distance you from X per se, but just because X is something else, you're imitating the nations around you. You, as Am Yisrael, need to have a specific, separate identity. Is it trying to distance us from something there, or is it trying to create something separate? Those are two ways conceptually that we could look at this prohibition. Interestingly, this week's parasha, what's the connection? Connection to Shemot is, we know the Midrash tells us in various places, various forms, that Bnei Israel were only redeemed from Egypt because they sank down to the 49th level of Tumah. The Midrash says at the sea, right? The Malachim were looking and they said, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah. Couldn't tell the difference between the Jews and the Mitzrayim, but there was a difference. That they kept their names, that they kept their clothing, they kept their language, they kept distinct in those ways. And all of this is related, perhaps, to this idea of Chukot HaGoyim. So maybe one of the first questions we could ask before we get into the sources, and again, I'll list some of the issues that come up, many issues where this comes up, where this question is asked. Again, what I'm raising now are topics which are questions. I'm not necessarily saying that these are forbidden, but the poskim discuss. And one of the issues is names. We actually mentioned last week, when we mentioned secular calendar, you'll remember that one of the sources inside the Maharam Shik, I'll come back to in a moment, was very vehement that one should not use the secular calendar. We came to the conclusion that there are reasons to allow it and to be lenient, but the Maharam Shik said one should not use it. Part of the reason is because he said this is Chukot HaAkub, Chukot HaGoyim. If you remember, just a moment, if we flip back in the book, so again, those who have it on Zoom won't see this, but those who have the book, if you go back to page 64, Page 64 was the Shut Maharam Shik, where he spoke about the fact that one should not use the calendar, the non-Jewish calendar, because that would be a prohibition of B'chukotehem lo telechu, that is going in their ways, in their statutes. Actually, on page 65 is Yabi Omer, which is Rav Ovadia Yosef, and he rejected that argument. Okay, so you see page 65, source number 4, with that which is in bold, said Rav Ovadia, she'en le'asor mishum b'chukotehem lo telechu, we'll go into more detail about this in today's shiur. But he said that where would we have a prohibition of the Chukotehem lo telechu? Where does the prohibition of Chukot HaGoyim apply? He said one of two conditions. Either Harishon, hu adavar she'en ta'amon nigleh, kedemash melashon chok. The word chok, we know, from Zot Chukat HaTorah, chok is something which we don't understand. So in the context of Chukim and Mishpatim, of Chukei Torah, it's something positive. The idea that Hashem commanded something, we don't understand why. Nonetheless, we say this is a chok, this is a gzerah, which we have to keep. Over here, the negative way, if the non-Jews have a chok, so it's not commanded by Kadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah, but it's a lehavdil, it's a chok, it has no reason, it has no sense behind it. So then if you're imitating that, that would be a prohibition. Right? He says, שכיוון שהוא עושה דבר משונה, שאין בו טעם נגלה אלא מפני שהם נוהגים כן, you do something strange, not for any specific reason, not for any obvious reason, but because that's what the nations of the world do, אז נראה ודאי כנמשך אחריהם ומודה להם. Then it would seem like you are just doing it for the sake of imitating them. And that would be a problem. שאם לא כן, למה יעשה כדברים התמוהים ההם? If not so, why are you doing it? Again, if there's logic for it, if there's a reason for it, if it's part of, the non-Jews go to doctors and they develop medicine and they develop vaccines and they develop all sorts of treatments. So we do that. There's a reason. But nonetheless, here's number 2. It says Hasheni hu davar sheshayach bo pritzut v'chadom. So something which has which is licentious, which is sexually immoral, things like that. Those kind of practices would be forbidden as well. Okay, that's what we'll see. We'll see in a moment where Rabbi gets that from. But he says nonetheless, neither of those would apply to using the calendar, and therefore, as we discussed last week, there would not be a prohibition of using the secular calendar. Certainly not for the reason of Chukot HaGoyim. Now, I mentioned the Maharam Shik. It's very interesting. I don't know if people know, but the name Maharam Shik, where it comes from. So the Maharam Shik was a Talmud of the Chatam Sofer. And again, on all these kind of sugyot, you see that he was fighting against a movement which was trying to shake off Jewish identity, which was trying to very much integrate into the world at the expense of Jewish identity and Jewish culture and Torah values. And therefore, he is vehemently opposed to the idea of using the secular calendar. He's vehemently opposed to the idea of using non-Jewish names. And in fact, in his day, right, surnames are a relatively recent invention. Going back, when we call somebody up to the Torah, we call up your name, Ben, father's name. That's always been the name. Surnames are something which are relatively new. In the Maharam Shik's day, there was a gezerah in the place where he lived that they all had to have a surname, had to have a secular name. So the name he chose was Shik, which is Roshei Tevot, which is an acronym for Shem Yisrael Kadosh. And that is where it comes from. Shem Yisrael Kadosh, meaning the holy name of Israel, and that's why it's called the Maharam Shik. Again, in his Tshuvot, he's very, very strong and very vehement against using a secular name, using a non-Jewish name. He seems to say that it's a Torah prohibition, but Moshe Feinstein argues against it. Moshe Feinstein, the truth is, the Maharam Shik in other places, it may not be so simple, but Moshe Feinstein says, that which we see, that Bnei Israel were only redeemed from Egypt because they didn't change their names, and they didn't change their dress, and they didn't change their language. That was before Matan Torah. That was before we had necessarily mitzvot and the Torah of love keeping us apart. So the only way that they could keep their identity, and the only way it was recognizable that this was Bnei Israel before they had the Torah mitzvot, was through these 3 things. He says, but it's possible, right? Still a good thing. It doesn't mean you shouldn't throw out your Jewish names, don't throw out your Jewish dress, etc. But once you have Kiyum Torah mitzvot, that is a heker, that is what sets us apart and makes us recognizable as Jews. So then the Indian is not as severe. He also says, that once you have a name, even if it started off as a non-Jewish name, but it's been used for generations, it's become a Jewish name as well. That would not be a prohibition per se. He goes through a number of places in the Rishonim where we find non-Jewish names actually of the Rishonim. There's Tosfot quotes Rabbeinu Peter, which in English loosely translated as Peter. That was one of the Balei Tosfot. And we find different names. We find, for example, Alexander is used as a Jewish name, going back to the days of Alexander Macedon, originally as a way of praise, respect to the king that was used. But after the generations, it became a Jewish name as well, and so on and so forth. So that's an interesting discussion that takes place regarding names. And generally, what the poskim say is, if one has a non-Jewish name, because that's just the name, that's just what you use, that's the convenience, that's the culture, that would be acceptable. If somebody has a Jewish name and specifically decides, I'm not going to use the Jewish name, I'm going to go out and get a Christian name and use that, and that is a sign that somebody is rebelling against and throwing out their religion, that's what we're talking about when we say that that's going to be that's going to be an issue. But so that's one issue the poskim discuss. Other questions, areas where this issue of Chukot HaGoyim might come up. So I mentioned the secular calendar. Birthdays. Can a person celebrate a birthday? Can a person celebrate any day according to the secular calendar? Is that an issue of Chukot HaGoyim? For the Americans here in the audience, a question which comes up all the poskim grapple with in the last generation: Thanksgiving. Can one celebrate Thanksgiving? Should one celebrate Thanksgiving? What I will say, as somebody who's not American, somebody who didn't grow up in America, and this was never a part of their culture. Somebody decides to come along and, introduce this day when they can eat turkey and celebrate Thanksgiving. That seems a little bit strange, but somebody who grew up with us and it's part of the culture. So the discussion, is it considered a religious festival? Is it a not religious festival? Thanksgiving The idea of giving thanks certainly is a Jewish value. This is something which comes up, which is a very, very primary theme throughout the parashiot of Sefer Shemot as well. Is that we'll discuss, probably not today, maybe next week. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about Thanksgiving, because Rav Moshe Feinstein has got 3 different tshuvot about it. He seems to contradict himself, and then he explains, very interesting. Is this a question of Chukot HaGoyim? Well, I mentioned names already, mentioned language, dress comes up a lot in terms of dress, in terms of fashion, copying the ways of non-Jewish fashion. Is that an issue of Chukot HaGoyim? We'll see what the poskim have to say about that. Significant life events, right? This comes up by chuppot. When there was first a move to start having a chuppah inside the shul, to have a wedding inside the place of worship, that is, there's a non-Jewish custom to have a wedding inside the place of worship as well. Is that something which is allowed? Is that something which is desirable? What about in terms of mourning? Many mourning customs, many people, when you go to, for centuries, when, I'm not even talking about funerals, but when you go to visit a grave, you go visit a kever, Jews have always placed a stone on a kever. In Israel, it's very prevalent, and you'll see people lay wreaths, or people put flowers. That again comes from a non-Jewish custom. Is that a question of Chukot HaGoyim? Talking about flowers, there was a great controversy going back a few centuries in terms of putting flowers in the shul. Bringing flowers in the shul on Shavuot. I don't know what the custom is here. Right? That is, the Vilna Gaon would not be happy with us. But many other poskim would, and many accept it. But that is a question. The Vilna Gaon came out very, very strongly. He said, bringing these flowers inside the shul, into the place of worship, that has its origins. So he claimed from the non-Jewish world, and that may be an issue of Chukot HaGoyim. Number of weeks ago, a number of months ago, Rabbi Wein spoke about stained glass windows. That also there were poskim who said that comes from the non-Jewish world. Music. Can you have music? Can you have music in your services? Right? So these are some of the questions, also general culture. Bringing all these issues, we're not going to be able to discuss all of them, but just to show how prevalent and how widespread this question is, and it's something which pops up in many, many different places, many different areas. So let's jump back into the book, into Tzurba. In order to understand the sugya of Chukot HaGoyim, there are 2 primary Gemarot which deal with this, one in Avodah Zarah and one in Sanhedrin. There seems to be somewhat of a contradiction between these 2 Gemarot. And based on that, based on the way we resolve that difficulty, we come up with the fundamental criteria, the parameters for when Chukot HaGoyim would apply and when it wouldn't apply, and from there we can see the Rishonim and the Achronim. So let's begin. We're now on page 102, the page that says at the top, the definition of the prohibition. And it brings us these 2 Gemarot. The first Gemara, which we'll discuss, is in Masechet Sanhedrin. I'll start off and say, neither of these Gemarot, the discussions are not going to be practical halakha for us nowadays, but very much we can derive the principles from. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin starts off with the Mishnah, talks about the death penalty. When you have a Sanhedrin, which is judging capital cases, and there are 4 different types of chavei mitah, skila, shreifa, hereg, v'chenek. The Gemara over here is talking about hereg. Hereg, loosely translated as beheading. For certain averot, certain transgressions which a person would do, if they were chayav mitah, this is what they would receive. Again, just another brief introduction. Those of you who are in the Gemara shir will know that these things do not take place very often. Meaning the conditions that are needed in order for the Sanhedrin actually to execute the death penalty, you need to have witnesses, there needs to be warning. The warning is very specific. The warning has to be directly, immediately preceding the act. The person committing the act needs to acknowledge that he's heard the warning. He needs to acknowledge that, not only acknowledge that he's heard the warning, he needs to acknowledge that he understands that this will lead to the death penalty, and then toch kedei dibor, approximately within 3 seconds after acknowledging that, he still commits it, right? The Mishnah discusses how the Sanhedrin, over and above that, has a responsibility to, wherever they can, find a loophole, quote unquote, so that they will not have to execute the death penalty. Sometimes they will. Discussion in the Gemara, should it be done once in 7, if it's done once in 7 years or once in 70 years? Is that a Sanhedrin that is executing this excessively? In any event, but the Torah gives us these penalties in order for us to understand the importance of the mitzvah, in order for us to understand the severity of certain transgression. And so it was once in a while practical. So there's a question in terms of hereg, in terms of beheading, how should it be performed? Says the Mishnah, in Sanhedrin, source number 9, page 102, mitzvah taner ragin. Also, it's fascinating. We know the mitzvah, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself. The Gemara talks about that, talks about the fulfillment of mitzvah ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in terms of the Sanhedrin fulfilling the death penalty. The death penalty needs to be done in such a way that it's, to fulfill to fulfill this mitzvah of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, it should not be done in a sort of degrading way. And here the Mishnah discusses how it should be executed. So it says, mitzvah tener ragin, hayu matizin drosho b'sayif, k'derech shemalchut oseh. The opinion of Tanakama is that this beheading is done with the sword in the same way as the malchut does it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, thankfully today's malchut doesn't do it anymore, but that's the way it was then. Rabbi Yehuda Omer,
depends which country living.
Depends which country, fair point. Okay. The countries that people here come from, I think we're okay. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer nivuhu lo. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Killing with a sword would be a degrading method of death. Ela manichim et rosho al sadan v'kotetz v'kopis. He says no. You chop his head off with an axe. Amru lo ein mitam novelet mizo. So Chachamim say no. That's more degrading. Okay, we have a discussion. What's more degrading? I don't really know how to rank this, but whether it is with a sword or with an axe. And then the Gemara explains, says Tanya, Amar le'en Rabbi Yehuda le'chachamim, afani yodea shemitam noveleti. So says Rabbi Yehuda, actually, you're right. I understand and I agree with you that with an axe is what we call menovelet. This is degrading. Aval ma'el said, but what can I do? Sharei amra Torah b'chukotehem lo telechu. The Torah said, b'chukotehem lo telechu. Do not copy, do not imitate the ways of the nations. This killing with a sword, that is the prevalent practice, that is the non-Jewish custom, and therefore you cannot emulate it, says Rabbi Yehuda. V'Rabbanan, so what about Rabbanan? Also have the pasuk. They also know that there is a mitzvah, there's a prohibition of chukot hagoyim. Will they answer? Kevan dichtiv saif be'oraita lo minayu ka'gamrinan. So say Rabbanan, no, you're right that this is the practice of the non-Jewish nations of the world as well. However, it's written in the Torah. It's written in the Torah, the concept of Saif, and therefore we're not learning it from them. Maybe they learned it from us, I don't know. But the point is, it's written, if it's already written in the Torah, we already have an explicit pasuk, that would not be a prohibition of the Chukotehem lo telech. So that is the first Gemara in Sanhedrin, okay? Telling us that why a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan, whether killing with a sword is a transgression of Chukot Hagim or not, answers Rabbanan and Halachas like Rabbanan that it's not, because we have a pasuk. We have a pasuk, it's written in the Torah. That's the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Now later on, the Gemara is going to address the second case, which we're about to look at, but we'll look at it from the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. So says the Gemara in Avodah Zarah the following. We mentioned, I don't remember if it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago. There's a concept, right? The Mishnah, very beginning of Masechet Avodah Zarah tells us that when you have a nation who worships idolatrous entities, that you cannot do, if they have a Yom Tov, right? They have a festival of idolatry. Within 3 days of that festival, you cannot do business with them. You cannot engage in commerce, because we are concerned that within those 3 days they will come and they will thank their gods, and you are therefore complicit in their avodah zarah, in their idolatry. So, in order to know when you can and can't do business, the Gemara goes through and lists the days, the festivals of avodah zarah. Most of these are foreign to us now, but we'll see a principle which applies. Says the Mishnah in source number 10, V'einu eidehen shel avdei kochavim. These are their festivals, right? Kalanda, V'saltonia, V'kaltis, whatever these days are. V'yom gnusya shel malchehem, v'yom aleida, v'yom amita. Okay, regarding their kings, so the day of ascent of the king to the throne, the day of his birth, and the day of his death, these are considered their days of idolatry. Right? Everything was all mixed up. There, the king may be human, but we know that in many of these ancient cultures as well, the king was treated as a sort of a deity, and this is a day which is used to worship their foreign gods. That is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim, kol mita sheyesh ba sreifa, yesh ba avodat kochavim, v'she'en ba sreifa, ein ba avodat kochavim. very interesting. Say Chachamim that regarding the day of death of the king, so it depends. It depends if they perform this ritual of sreifa, of burning, explain in a moment. If this burning takes place, that is considered as a day of idolatry. Burning does not take place, it is not. What is this burning? It was the custom which was prevalent in the ancient world, is that when the king died, the king's possessions would be burned. Why? What's the logic? So that nobody else can come benefit from them. Somebody else to come and sit on the king's throne. Somebody else is going to come and wear the king's robes, right? That is going to be degrading to the previous king. Who are you to come? So rather that is, weren't worried about Baal Tashbit. They went and they burnt everything. And that was part of this religious ceremony. Says Rabbi Meir, that where this burning took place, that is considered Avodah Zarah. So says the Gemara now in source number 11, Miklal Rabbi Meir Savar, lo shna mita sheyesh ba shreifa, velo shna mita she'en ba shreifa, palchi ba la'avodat kochavim, ein ma shreifa lav chukai. In other words, so the Gemara goes through, this is already 3 daf later in the Gemara, so there's a bit of a discussion, but talking about whether there's burning or not, whether they, we see that it's discussing whether they worship, they worship idols, related to this. And then it says, Miklal de Rabbanan Savri, Shreifa Chukai, we see that there's an idea that this burning is in and of itself something to do with Avodah Zarah. V'atanya sorfin alam lachim v'lo midarkei amori v'chukai ananei sorfin. In other words, what the Gemara is asking, the question the Gemara says is that this idea of burning for the kings is something which the non-Jews did. It's something that there was a Jewish practice to do this as well. In fact, the Gemara mentions to us that it's mentioned in Sefer Yirmiyahu. It's brought in the Tanakh that this was a practice in the ancient world. It was not exclusively limited to non-Jews. And the question is, if it is one of their statutes, what happened to Chukot HaGoyim? How can you do this as well? So it says the Gemara on the top of page 103. We're going to see the last line in the Gemara is what's important for our purposes. It says, everybody says no. The shreifa, the burning is not a statute. In other words, this is not the burning itself is not part of the act of Avodah Zarah, not part of their worship. Ela chashivutahu. Those are the 3 words we need to remember. That it's not that it's ela chashivutahu, meaning it is a sign of importance. Why do they burn these objects? This is not a religious ceremony. This is not a ceremony of Avodah Zarah. This is a ceremony of giving credit, giving importance to the king, giving importance to the king, because nobody else is allowed to use the king's possession. He's died. They're gone. They're gone with it. And therefore, that's the answer. The conclusion of the Gemara in Avodah Zarah is that this practice of burning is considered a chashivuta. It's not considered a chukah. It's not considered a law of the non-Jewish nations, but rather it is just a way of showing importance, and therefore it's allowed. Now, Tosfot asks the following question over here. If you think about the 2 Gemarot which we've just seen, right, the first Gemara in Sanhedrin told us that both of them had the same question. Both of them said there is a practice which is fulfilled by the Jewish nation, which is a practice which is fulfilled by the non-Jews. How are we allowed to do it? Because of what about the question of B'chukotehem lo telechem? In the Gemara in Sanhedrin, it was only a question on Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. But Rabbi Yehuda's answer was, it was only a question on Chachamim's opinion, because Rabbi Yehuda said you can't do it because it's B'chukotehem lo telechem. Said Rabbanan, no, it's written in the Torah. We have a source. Okay, and in fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin then continues and discusses this practice of burning of the king, and it says that also is not prohibited because we have a pasuk mentioned. It's written in the Tanakh, it's written in Sefer Yirmiyah. However, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which asks the same question based on the burning the objects of the king, it says this is not a problem of why? Because it is what the Gemara calls chashivuta. But there the Gemara does not give the answer of that it's written in the Torah, that it's written in the Tanakh. Why not? Why doesn't it say that? So Tosfot answer, and they give the following explanation. They say, well, the first thing when we're talking about Chukot HaGoyim, the first question we have to ask is the specific practice in question. Does it have its roots in idolatry or not? If it doesn't have anything to do with idolatry, so then it's okay to say, well, it's written in the Torah, we've seen it before, and therefore we can follow it. However, says Tosfot, if it's got to do with idolatry, then there is no way that it's going to be completely forbidden, that it's going to be much more severe, and that is why he explains the Gemara Avodah Zarah says about this burning of the kings has to tell us first of all it's chashivuta, and it's not Avodah Zarah, because if it was Avodah Zarah, the fact that it's even then it's written in the Tanakh it doesn't help us, which should still be forbidden. Have a look at Tosfot, source number 12, page 103. Says Tosfot as follows: Lekach piresh li. When we say there are two types of chukim that we are talking about. The first type is chok, which is connected to avodah zarah, to idolatry. Another one which has got nothing to do with idolatry, but it's just nonsense, folly. It's just something which they do. Over here, our Gemara is talking about here it's talking about something which is done for the sake of avodah zarah, and this is what it means to say Rabbi Meir that the Gemara is teaching you that yes, Rabbi Meir is telling us that this burning is not in and of itself idolatry. Says what the Gemara means to say. If it was a chukah of idolatry, how could we follow it? In bold now. Says, even though it's mentioned, we saw it's mentioned in the Tanakh, nonetheless, it should still be forbidden. It's something which is done for avodah zarah, and therefore we cannot do it. And at the kume alma lav choku l'shem avodat kochavim u'mikom makom chok hevel v'shtur. Okay, it says therefore in our sugya the conclusion is that this burning which is done for the king is not a chok of avodah zarah, and therefore the fact that it's chashivut, and therefore the fact that it's written in the Torah means it would be allowed. But if it was something which is just for the sake of for avodah zarah, completely forbidden, there is no room. And one is not able to emulate them. So that is the first major opinion we have in the Rishonim. That is the approach of Tosfot. Tosfot tells us that when it comes to the main concern we have when it comes to b'chukotehem lo telechu is something connected to avodah zarah. And if it's something which they do for the sake of avodah zarah, forget about it. There's nothing to talk about. If it's not for the sake of avodah zarah, well then, if it's something which we have first, or something which is there's an indication in the Torah or something like that, then we would not need to be we not need to be concerned. I just want to share with you for a moment the Rambam. This is in the Sefer in front of you, but this is the Rambam in Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11 of Hilchot Avodah Zarah. He says the following. He says, "En holchin b'chukot hagoyim v'lo midamin lahen." We do not follow in the statutes of the nations. We do not try and imitate them. Lo b'malbush, lo b'sayav v'chayotze behen. Not with dress, not with hairstyles, etc. Shneimar v'lo techu b'chukot hagoy. As is well known, the Rambam writes the reason why the whole question about shaving and of peyot, of shaving, leaving sideburns. He says the reason why the Torah gave us those commands is because the priests of idolatry had a certain, this was their practice, that they would shave their hair in such a way, and therefore the Torah told us not to. But he says, so it's warning us not to emulate them. Should be separate from them. Should be identifiable with clothing, and our actions, as we are in our hashkafot as well. Again, we always have to remember when we're reading these words from the Psukim and the Rambam, again, the nations around which he was referring to, the Meiri writes in a number of places that many of these halachot that we have regarding the non-Jewish nations do not apply nowadays. There was a specific time and a specific place, and the practices which were being worshipped, as we mentioned in Eretz Canaan and in Eretz Mitzrayim, were of a certain nature, which the Torah always wants us to very much be apart from. Now it's interesting that the Rambam, he continues, this is all he brings us in the section of Avodah Zarah. So from Tosfot, we see from the Rambam as well, seems very much to be related to the idea of distancing us from Avodah Zarah. And we've been speaking about Avodah Zarah for 3 weeks already. I'll just add this, that the Torah tells us, Pirkei Avot, asu siag laTorah. We know that many times the Chachamim have an injunction to add on gzerot, to add on takanot, to add on fences, so that we will not come to transgress Torah prohibitions. For example, right, Shabbat, and this is probably the most famous one. You ask any kid about something that you can't do on Shabbat. How many times my children said to me, Abba, is this muktzah? They don't mean muktzah. They mean, can you do something on Shabbat or not? Is it muktzah to do X? Right? Muktzah is really a rabbinic prohibition. The rabbinic prohibition to move, to carry, to handle certain objects in order that you won't. The most famous example, right? You can't even if you were to pick something up and to perform its prescribed action, that would be a prohibition of Shabbat, a transgression of Shabbat. Therefore, Chachamim said, don't even pick it up, so you won't do it. Right? Chachamim create a fence. Sometimes there are certain mitzvot where the Torah itself creates a fence, i.e., there is already that previous step is itself a Torah prohibition. Not to say you can do it, right? But the Torah said, for example, talk about this, right? It might be that on Pesach, the Torah says, not only can you not eat chametz, the Torah says you can't even own chametz, so that you won't come to eat it. Once it's a Torah prohibition, it means even if there's no concern that you would eat it, you still can't own it, the Torah said. But Avodah Zarah is another one of those, where the Torah is concerned, in order that we won't worship Avodah Zarah, don't even come close, don't do certain things, don't imitate these ways, etc. So we've seen Tosfot. Let's see the Maharik. Now page 104. The Maharik, who was a posek in Italy in the 15th century, he was asked the following question. Down. Non-Jewish world, this is a non-Jewish statute. Is this a transgression of v'chukatehem lo telechu, or is a doctor allowed to wear one of these capes? So he says the following, source number 13, page 104, the Mahari Kolon of Yosef ben Shlomo Kolon. It says the following: לעניות דעתי נראה דבר פשוט, דלא לאסור משום חוק, אלא באחד משני חלקים. Right, this should be familiar because we saw Rav Avadia going in B'kvot HaMarik earlier on. He says that when we have an issue of Chukat HaGoyim, it's only going to be forbidden in one of the following two ways. Ha'echad, hu hadavar asher ein ta'amo nigler k'demashmo l'shon chok, davar asher ta'amo ne'elam. As we already mentioned, from the language of chok, meaning something you don't understand, something which has no reason. And again, what's the logic? If something has no reason, but you're only doing it to imitate, well, the Torah says don't imitate. You've got the Torah, you've got 613 mitzvot, you've got what Hashem told you to do. That's enough. You're going to start imitating this and imitating that. That is improper. If there's no reason for it, that seems to be an indication that the only reason you're doing it is because you want to follow along. You want to follow along in their ways. So that is reason number one. Reason number two, he says. I'm now skipping, but we're still on the same source number 13, about not quite halfway down, but you'll see 3 dots on the line towards the end, and it says V'inyan hasheni. V'inyan hasheni yesh לאסור משום חוגות הגויים, לפי הנזכר לעניות דעתי, הוא הדבר אשר שייך בו נדנות, פריצת גדר, הצניעות והענווה. Something which breaches the fences of modesty and humility, something which has pritzut, something which has licentiousness, that would be, even if it has a reason, but it's something which we want to avoid, and therefore that would be forbidden. And therefore, his conclusion. Somebody says they do this, I want to imitate them, that is forbidden. But anything else not. And therefore, now in bold, he says, the wearing of this cape, this white coat, whatever it is, says the Maharik, it's okay. Don't worry, doctor. You can go and you can wear your white coat, you can wear your lanyard, you can wear whatever you want. Why? He says, There's a reason for this. It shows everybody, it's a sort of a uniform. Everybody can tell that this is a doctor, and that would be that's not a prohibition of פקודות הגויים. ואין לתלות לבישתה כי אם לתועלת הנמשך ממנו, הן מחמת הכבוד, הן מחמת הרווח ממון שמתוך כך. He says whether it's going to give you the gain of honor or financial gain, whatever it is, he says there's a clear reason for this. This is not connected to pritzut. This is not something which you're doing clearly to imitate the non-Jewish nations, and therefore that is going to be permitted. So that is the Shut Maharik, and those are the two leniencies which he brings. Now, when we fast forward another 100 years or so, we see in the Ramah on the next page, source number 14, the Ramah codifies the halachot as follows. He says, Kol zeh eino asur, saying that which one cannot imitate. This is b'chukotayim lo telech. He says, Kol zeh eino asur, ela b'davar shenagu bo avdei kochavim l'shem pritzut. Right? If it's something which is done for the sake of pritzut, of immodesty, that would be forbidden. The example in their days was kagon shenagu le'ubosh malbushim adumim, in terms of sort of wearing red clothing. Again, nowadays this is not something which, according to most, is still practical, the specific example. But nonetheless, if it has an element of pritzut, that would be forbidden. It says, or b'davar shenagu leminhag v'lachot ve'intam b'davar, or something which has no reason for it. De'ikar lamechash be'em mishum darkei ha'emori v'sheyesh po shemetz avodat kochavim me'avotehem. We're concerned that this may have an element of what's called darkei ha'emori. It may have an element of idolatry. But something which is done for the sake of toilet, for a practical purpose, right, as we've seen, somebody who is anybody who's an expert doctor has a certain uniform. We also have to remember, whenever we talk about doctors, we talk about medicine, nowadays person goes to it's clear that a person goes to a doctor. A doctor is somebody who has studied in medical school, who has a license, who is right, somebody who's qualified. Going back again, not that long ago in history, anybody could say that they're a doctor. Anybody could pretend again that the qualifications were not standardized. There's a halakha in Shulchan Aruch that a person has to go to the best doctor that is available. Right? The best doctor that's available. For somebody who's less qualified, you're not allowed to go and see them. You have to go to, this is, by the way, this is a fascinating point which is going to come out Wednesday night shiurim when we talk about artificial intelligence. What happens when artificial intelligence gets better than human being? Are you still allowed to go and see a human being or not? Brief spoiler, but you have to come on Wednesday night and hear about that. But in any event, so the poskim say that halakha doesn't apply nowadays. That when there is a baseline of qualification, you can go to any doctor who's qualified or certified. That's allowed. But so in those days, again, there really was a need for this, to see this uniform set aside somebody, but as a professional. But in any event, now this Ramah, everybody brings this Ramah and says the Ramah paskins like the Maharik, right? And as you've just seen, the Maharik gave two reasons. The Ramah gave two reasons. Seems to be saying the same thing. However, Moshe Feinstein, Igrot Moshe, he was asked also a question about clothing. He was asked if immigrants from Poland who come to America, and there's a different dress code, right? What the suits and things that they wear nowadays, he was asked if they can wear that, or that is, changed from their traditional Jewish garb to the traditional American garb, right? Could they do that? Is that a problem of b'chukotayim lo telechu? His conclusion over there is that no, it's not. You can dress in that way. But he says the Ramah over here is similar to the Maharik, but he's actually following a slightly different opinion. And this is the opinion of the Ran.
I pull you back a little.
He says he gave you two reasons. One reason is he said if the minhag v'chok follows ways of pritzut, of immodesty, that's forbidden. Everybody agrees. And if it's something which has no reason, it's a chok. It has no reason. Has no reason or logic to it, then that is something which you cannot imitate. But notice the difference. The Maharik said, what's the reason why you can't emulate it if it has no reason? Because that seems to be an indication that the reason you're emulating it is because you want to emulate the non-Jews. You want to imitate it. You want to do it for no reason other than the fact that they do it. Notice what the Rama says, and this is from the Ran. The Rama says, if there is no reason, right about halfway through source 14, which we just read, he said, he says, we're concerned if there's no reason, we're concerned that maybe there was a reason once upon a time. And that reason was because it was connected to Avodah Zarah. Right? That's why we're worried that the non-Jews that got minhag avotahem b'dehem, right? They're still keeping this, even though nowadays we don't see it. Let's look at the calendar as an example, right? You have certain names and certain dates on the calendar which are initially had connected to, had their roots in Avodah Zarah, and the names are often named after certain gods, certain things like that. Nowadays, there's no reason. Okay, the calendar, as we've already mentioned, will not be forbidden, will not fall under this because everybody has a practical purpose and reason for using the calendar. But in other words, where there is a chok, which has no reason, according to the Ran and according to the Rama, the reason why you can't emulate it is because it may have had a reason, a root in Avodah Zarah. According to the Maharik, Avodah Zarah. So over here, the Rama may be a bit more lenient, because if there is something which which doesn't really seem to have a logical reason, but I know for sure that it's not connected to Avodah Zarah, maybe according to the Rama that would still be permitted, whereas according to the Maharik that would be forbidden. That's the chiluk which Moshe Feinstein makes in the Yom. I just want to show. So we've seen the opinion of the Tosfot, we've seen the opinion of the Maharik, the Ran, and the Rama, which is very, very similar with a slight nuance according to Moshe Feinstein. Just want to mention here the opinion of the Gra. And as I said, next week we'll get into many of the practical examples and applications of this. But the Vilna Gaon, it's well known over here, is very, very machmir. Mentioned at the beginning of the shir, the Vilna Gaon's opinion regarding flowers in the Shul and Shavuot. We'll talk about that next week as well. But the Vilna Gaon says the following. He says everything which you've all said, which the Maharik said, and Tosfot and everything, he says everybody here is being too lenient. He says, go back and look at the Gemara, which we saw, the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Okay, we saw the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim regarding killing, and Chachamim said to Rabbi Yehuda, the reason why we allow killing with a scythe for the sword rather than an axe, even though it's less degrading, even though the non-Jews do it, it's because it's written in the Torah, because we have a source, we have a pasuk. In other words, there's the Gemara. If you did not have the fact that it's written in the Torah, it would be forbidden. But what we've been saying until now, what the Maharik said and what the Ran said was, when is it going to be forbidden? When it's a chok, when there's no reason. Over here, there is a reason. The reason is it's less degrading. Less degrading to chop off your head with a sword than with an axe. Okay, but there's a reason for it. There's a logic. But we don't accept that as the reason. Says, based on this, says the Vilna Gaon, we see from here something extraordinary. If there is chukot hagoyim, it has a logical reason for it, but it's not something that we would have thought. Meaning, we're only doing it because we're imitating them, but even though that it's got we wouldn't have thought of it on our own. We would only have thought of it because we're imitating the tradition as well. Have a look at source number 16, page 106. Says the Biur Gra, that's the Vilna Gaon. אלא דוודאי הכל אסור, רק דווקא ללמוד מהם אסור. Right, to learn from them is going to be forbidden, כמו שכתוב, כיוון דכתיב לא מנהיו גמרינן, ולאו דווקא משום דכתיב ברייתא, אלא כל דבר שהיינו עושים זולתם מותר. In other words, he said, therefore, anything we would have done on our own is permitted. So there's technological advancement in the world, there's different things, we might have thought of it by ourselves, we might have developed it ourselves, that is okay. But anything that we would not have developed ourselves, I don't know what the Vilna Gaon would have said about stained glass windows, but that's something which we've seen, we've copied it from the nations around. Maybe that would be forbidden. But certainly what he said about the plants and the flowers in the shul, I'll say this opinion of the Gra, it's quoted, it wasn't really accepted. It's very, very stringent. It's a very machmir approach, and the vast majority of the Achronim and Poskim do not accept it. But it's important to know that it's there, and that is the Vilna Gaon. So to summarize, what we've seen is that the Torah says, the Torah wants Am Yisrael to have a unique and distinct identity. It certainly wants to separate us from the negative things, the negative practices which occurred in the nation, in the area where we lived and around us. It does not want us to be negatively influenced culturally in terms of where and how this applies. So everybody agrees that if there is a chok, if there is a practice which has its roots in Avodah Zarah, which is connected to Avodah Zarah, that we are certainly not allowed to emulate. If it is something which has no logical reason or purpose, and the only reason why we may be emulating is just to emulate and just to copy, that is also going to be forbidden. If it's something which serves a reason, if it's something that's not connected to Avodah Zarah, something that we might have thought of ourselves, then that is going to be permitted. And we mentioned a number of different questions which come up, which we'll discuss more next week. We've got the meaning of kaparot, we're going to have a head covering, different things in terms of the shul, customs of avelut, of chupot, of Thanksgiving. Another question the poskim discuss also is in terms of standing of the siren, which we do, which is the minhag and is a practice in Medinat Israel nowadays on Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, where we stand in memory of the fallen, in memory of the victims of the Shoah. That is certainly, I'll say already right now, that is something which we do, and we should follow that practice, and that is a very halachically sound thing to do. But we have to explain why that is, and why that is not a problem for Kota Goyim, as some have raised. But we'll talk more about that next week. Thank you everybody for coming. Please leave the books behind, and we'll see you all next week.
If you want to purchase the volume, it's 30 shekels. Otherwise, please keep it in the back. Beginning to some of this fun.